A reading from John, the 13th chapter. Now before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and to go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. During supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. And he came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" And Jesus answered, "You do not know what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." And Jesus answered, Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." And Jesus said to him, "One who is bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For Jesus knew who was to betray him, and for this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." And after he had washed their feet and had put on his robe and returned to the table, Jesus said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example, that you should also do as I have done to you. Very truly I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." And continuing at verse 31, When Judas had gone out, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Jews, I now say to you, where I am, you cannot come. So I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for one another." Or one for another. The gospel of the Lord. So, as I said earlier, Lent has seen fit to rob us of everything. And I say that somewhat in jest, but today I had picked out this wonderful stone that I was going to use because it fit in so well with the story I'm going to use with my sermon. And it's raining. And so here I am, you get my basement instead. And if you know me from South Carolina, there's a likelihood you've heard this story. But I can't think of one that fits better for this moment than this story. There was a castle in a kingdom. And in this kingdom and in this castle, in the middle of the great hall, there was a stone table. No one knew where that table had come from, because it just appeared there one day, generations ago. And on that table every day, there would be a loaf of bread that was left. And that loaf of bread would be there, and no one knew where it came from. They just know that it showed up. Now this loaf of bread had with it some mysteries. The mysteries were that anyone who ate it would become a servant, and no one wanted to become a servant, so no one ate it. And the second mystery associated with it was that anyone who ate it would disappear. No one wanted to disappear. No one ate the bread. Third mystery is that anyone who eats the bread is going to die. Well, if they didn't want to be a servant and they just didn't want to disappear, no one wanted to die. No one ate the bread. But associated with this mystery was also a practice that every person in the kingdom, when they came of age, would be taken into this room with the stone table, before this loaf of bread, with their friends and their families, with their parents and their teachers, and with everybody who could gather. And on this night, they would be given the opportunity, when they came of age, to eat the bread. Generation after generation, people were led to this table. Generation after generation, no one ate the bread. Until one day, when a young person was brought before the table, and they were offered this choice: will you eat the bread? And they said yes. And the chief priests harumphed, and mom and dad cried and pled with the person and said, you don't know what you're doing. But tradition dictated that everyone must answer this question 3 times. And so they asked the question again: will you eat the bread? And the person said yes. And mom and dad got frustrated because this was a willful response. And the friends and neighbors all got upset because this was breaking generations of tradition. And again, it was time for the 3rd question to be asked. And the priests and the leaders of the ceremony asked the question in such a way that if you answered yes, you were obviously dumb. Will you eat the bread? And again, this young person said yes. And they ate the bread. And mom and dad wept. And their friends were offended. And the priests and the scholars and the teachers were all angry, because this has never happened before. And not only were they a people who valued their own production and who valued their community, they were also a people who valued tradition almost more than anything. And so that day, the person walked out alone, now an adult. And it is true, that person did become a servant to everybody. Whenever anyone needed help, they were there providing help. One year when a widow was trying to sow her crops by herself, this young person went and helped her sow her crops and spent their whole time helping there instead of helping their family. And it is true that that person did disappear. This person went far and wide and helped in other places. And so for long stretches of time, they were absent from their community. And it is true that this one who ate the bread did die. Because remember, I said that this community valued above all things tradition. And it was traditional that people would go into the family business. It was traditional that people would be present for those important occasions and not be off far and wide gallivanting around helping other people. And it was tradition that everyone would do for themselves. And so this 3rd piece came true when they took this young person and stoned them and killed them. And this person did die. All of us, through the waters of baptism, are called to the table where we have a choice to eat this bread that God has given us. St. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, "For I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night in which he was betrayed, took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body that is for you. Do this for the remembrance of me.' In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.'" And we are invited to make this choice. Will we eat this bread that calls us to become servants? That calls us to be absent from those things we might rather do, because there are moments when we're called away to serve others. We'll eat this bread that causes us to die to some of those things we might want because we want them only for ourselves. But take up the opportunity to rise to this new life in which we are called to do something different. Now remember, I said that this was a Thursday night campfire, And it happened that this was a devotion that was being given for elementary kids, and my cabin that week was 5th and 6th graders. And this was about my 6th or 7th straight week of having campers. It's not frequent that that happens, but sometimes it does because they happen to be short on males. And I was tired, and I was exhausted mentally and emotionally, and I was especially exhausted in terms of my patience, because we had this one camper in my cabin who, God bless him, was the clinger. And, you know, he was the one who spent the first night homesick. And then around Monday, he started asking me questions. And as soon as he started asking me questions, he did not stop until he fell asleep on Monday night. And Tuesday, he was asking me more questions and telling me more things. And Wednesday, I knew everything this child had ever done in his entire life. There is not a moment that he left out. And by Thursday, all I wanted for him to do was be quiet for 5 minutes, because can't I just get some peace? Oh, I was done. Because not only had I had campers for several weeks, but I had had some challenging campers. And I had this one camper who was just absolutely undoing me. And I was happy, because that evening my job was to play guitar, which means that I sat away from my cabin. And so, you know, I had about 2 months of hair growth going, and so I was, you know, a nice little long-haired guy. And, you know, I was off playing Amazing Grace to the tune of Peaceful Easy Feeling, and singing and enjoying myself and being away from everybody, when all of a sudden I look down and I see this young man holding a piece of bread, saying to me, "Eric, I know you're playing guitar, so I'm not sure that you're able to get your own bread. So I brought you some bread if you want to eat it." I brought you some bread if you want to eat it. Lent is a time that is all about invitation. You know, we hear the story of Jesus on the road with Mary and Martha. And Jesus weeps when Mary invites him to come and see the place where they laid Lazarus. Jesus invites the disciples into a new way of living by washing their feet. I brought you this bread if you want to eat it, because, Eric, I didn't think that you could eat it yourself. This wasn't blessed by any pastor, but this meal was communion. I don't know whether we should offer virtual communion or not. I go back and forth. There are things I like about it and things that I don't. But I can tell you this, that every day we're given a choice. We are given the choice whether we are going to live into the promise of our baptism and answer the call of Jesus to wash each other's feet and to represent the love of God, so that the world might see that. Because in this time where everything's going crazy, I know this, that Jesus doesn't tell the disciples that the world will know us by our adherence to correct doctrine. Jesus doesn't tell the disciples that the world will know us because we sing the correct hymns in the correct tune, with the correct tone, with the correct instrumentation. Jesus doesn't tell us that the world will know us by our theological treatises. Jesus tells the disciples that the world will know us by our love. After telling the disciples that in the same way that I've washed your feet, so you also are called to wash each other's feet. As we go out today, and I guess going out means getting off our couches, or talking to our friends, or talking to our families, or distance working, or wishing we were distance working. The question for us is the same as it's always been for the disciples. How will the world recognize God in you? And by the things that you say and do you recognize God in you? And know that Jesus is giving us the same invitation that we have been receiving for the last 2,000 years. The invitation that Mary gave Jesus as he approached the tomb of Lazarus. Come and see. Amen.